So this is an introduction to Masechet Nazir, which we begin in Mirz Hashem tomorrow, if you're doing the Daf Yomi. And the parsha is in Bamidbar Vav in Parshas Naso. And the Torah says that a person who takes a neder to be a Nazir, three different isurim, three different lavim apply to him. Number one, achila and shtia of yotzim and agefen. So he's not allowed to eat the grapes or any product of the grapes, any wine and so forth, or grape juice. Number two, he's not allowed to be mitami l'mesim. And number three, he's not allowed to do tiglachas, he's not allowed to cut his hair. At the termination of his naziris, he brings three karbanos. Number one, a keves li'ola. Number two, a kivs olachatos. And number three, an ayol shlomim. And then he has a whole ceremony of what's called tiglachas sa'aro. And basically, he cuts off all his hair and he puts it under the fire that's underneath the sear, the pot that they cooked the shlomim in. So when he brings his karbanos, then he completes his naziris. Now, what I'm going to try to do is summarize, there are many, many pages here to this introduction. I'll just summarize a few of the points. Number one, is there naziris bisman hazeh? The Rambam writes in Perik Beis Milchus naziris no heges bein bifnei abayis bein shelo bifnei abayis. And therefore, lefichach mishen nodar benazir bisman hazeh, if he takes a neder bisman hazeh, then even though he cannot bring his karbanos, and therefore he can never terminate his naziris, but he will be what's called a nazir olam, and we'll speak about a nazir olam in a few minutes. The Ravid disagrees with the Rambam, and he says that because today we're all tmeim, and it doesn't matter whether you're in Chutz La'aretz or in Eretz Yisrael, you're always in a state of tuma, and therefore you're not allowed to take a neder of naziris. I'll just add a point here that I myself saw in Nazir.
You're not allowed to take a neder of naziris,
according to the Rav, because
but if you
immediately you're tumble.
But if you do,
then you're what's called a Nazir Shimshon, which means that you're a Nazir Li'olam, but you're allowed to be Mitami L'mesim. And we'll get to Nazir Shimshon in just a minute. Now we have a principle in the Mishnah that's coming up at the beginning of the Masechet called Stam Nazir Shloshim Yom. And the Rambam says that if a person says Hareini Nazir, then the minimum amount of Naziris is always going to be 30 days. Even if he would say Hareini Nazir for 10 days or whatever number less than 30 days, automatically once he says Hareini Nazir, even for a day, he becomes a Nazir for 30 days. Now, in addition, we have a Minchas Chinuch who says that if he violates his Nazirus, then he gets two sets of malchus. Let's understand. Let's say he drinks a revius yayin, or he eats a kezayis worth of anovim, then he gets two sets of malchus, says the Minchas Chinuch. And this is going to be very important for us today. He gets malchus, number one, for violating the lav of mishras anovim, for eating the grapes. And on top of that, he gets another set of malchus, like any neder, for bal yachel dvara. So it means that if, let's say, he's megalech sa'ara, or he's metame, or as we said before, he drinks wine, in addition to the lavim, the individual lavim that he violates also like an all-encompassing lav of bal yachel dvara. So he gets two sets of malchus. And that's the Chiddush of Minchas Chinuch, which we'll see is very, very important for us. Now, there's a halacha, as you recall, from Masechet Nedarim of Yodayim, which means if you use and express yourself in an incomplete way, like a base achiza, a base yad of achilas kli, and that's considered a full lashon. And the same thing applies to Naziris. The Gemara has a special limud at the beginning of Masechet Nedarim, that it says Nazir lahazir, the double language that to teach us lasos, yodos, nazirus, kinazirus. And the question is going to be a machlokas abai v'rava if you have what's called a yad she'eno mochiach. Fine. Our next point that's very important is there's an isa tiglachas saro b'mei nazirus. So on that we have a Mishnah. And there is a situation in which a Nazir is allowed to be Megaleach Sa'ara. And that's called Tzaras, a Metzora. The Rambam writes in Hilchas Tumas Tzaras that if he has a Netek, which is a kind of Tzaras Haguf, And the law is that he has to cut off the netek, and around the netek, there are sa'aros, there are hairs that are growing. Then, for the sake of taros mitzora, to be mitayr his state of tzaras, he's allowed to override the iser of tiglachas nazir. And the Minchas Chinuch wants to know whether this applies to the most chamur on the entire scale. The hierarchy of Naziris on top of the list is called Naziris Shimshon. Now, we'll talk about Naziris Shimshon in a minute, but we have to know, why is Naziris Shimshon the most chamur of all the categories of Naziris? Because there's no such thing as She'ela on Naziris Shimshon. Naziris Shimshon is a kind of Naziris that comes like from a Malach Hashem, and therefore you cannot be matir that Naziris even through She'elas Chacham. And the Minchas Chinuch wants to say, and there's a tremendous pilpul on this in the Minchas Chinuch, that even in a case of Naziris Shimshon, which is the most chamur of any category of Naziris, nevertheless, for the sake of Taras HaMitzorah, we override the Iser of Tiglachas.
Is there a mitzvah say involved in Taras Mitzvah?
Yeah, it's one of the Taryah.
So that comes out, is that based on Asay Dochelos Asay?
Interesting question. I can't tell you. I suspect that this is another example of Esei Dochelos Aseh, but the other possibility is that it's a din of what's called Hutra. Hutra means it's not a Dechia, but within the context of Tumas Tzaras, the Torah never prohibited Tiglachas of a Nazir, possibly. Now, how does a Nazir Chas V'Shalom violate the Iser of Tiglachas? And there are 4 ways of doing so. One way is called Misparayim, where you have 2 blades and you catch the hair between the 2 blades. The other one is a Ta'ar, where you only have 1 razor. The third is Tolesh Biyad, and you would think that just like in Shabbos, you're potur, and that's not considered a Maisa that is Kedarko. But nevertheless, there's a separate ribui with regard to Tiglachas in Mitzorah that he violates the Iser even if he rips the hair out of his head. And the 4th way of violating this Iser is what's called Yachuv Ba'adama. There's an English word for it, what I forget it is, maybe you guys remember, that there's certain kinds of dilapidatories, what's it called? Depilatories. You should know there are people who still use them, men, I mean, even today. So that would also be another way of violating the Isa Tiglachas. The Gemara has at the end of Makkas a case where he dips his 5 fingers into this chemical substance, puts his 5 fingers on his head, he creates 5 different holes, and he gets 5 sets of malchus. Okay, now what about Giluach HaZakan? The Rashba writes in Chuvas that the Torah only said Ta'ar lo yavar al Rosho. It doesn't say anything about cutting your beard. However, the strange thing is that there's a Zohar that says that based on the pasuk Gadel Pera Sa'ar Rosho, and the understanding of the Zohar is, again, this is a subject unto itself, is that even to cut the hairs on his face, of his beard, is considered included in the Gadel Pera, and therefore he's not allowed to even shave. Now, with regard to the Iser of Yotzim and Agefen...
Wait, is that discussed in the Gemara?
No. This is a Zohar in Parshas Nosel. The Gemara seems to assume just the opposite, that there is no Iser of Giluach HaZakan in the case of a Nazir. Now, with regard to Yotzei min Agefen, he gets malchus for eating grapes as long as he has a shear of Kizayis, and for Shtiyas Yain, as we said before, the shear of a Revius. However, there is a halacha, believe it or not, of Kizayis, even with regard to Shtiyas Yain, and that's something different than what we're familiar. The Mishnah quotes 2 opinions. One opinion is that he's not chayiv until he drinks a Revius, and another opinion says that he drinks what would be the equivalent in volume of a Kizayis of Yain. Okay. Now, there's a whole sugya in Masechet Nazir about what's called the geffen itself. In other words, let's say he breaks off a piece of the vine and he makes some sort of edible substance out of it. Would he be violating the Isur? Then there's another Isur called Chartzanim Adzag. And these are different parts of the grapes that are not exactly full of juice inside of it, but the Torah prohibits that to a Nazir as well. Now, one of the big sugyas in the beginning of Masechet Naziris is whether or not a Nazir is allowed to make Kiddush al Hayayin. So we'll get to that in just 5 minutes. I just want to finish our Hakdama because that's going to be our major topic for today. Now, how many sets of Malchus would the Nazir be chayav for if he repeats the Isur? Let's say he drinks a kizayis and another kizayis, or eats a kizayis of anovim, another kizayis of anovim. If he's metame to one mess and then he's metame to another mess, if he cuts off the sa'ar, again, we didn't discuss the shear of how much the sa'ar he violates for the Isur Malchus. So this is a sugya here in Nazir that overlaps with the sugya at the end of Masechet Malchus. And basically it says the following. The Mishnah here in Nazir says, Nazir shal yashos yain kol hayom, eno chayav ala achas. However, the Gemara in Malchus says that if they give him multiple hasros, and each hasra separates each shtia of yayin, one from the other, he'll get Malchus for every single revius or kizayis of yayin that he drinks. And the same thing applies in Tuma Vitara. That means if he's metami to a mess, if they give him asra not to be metami to another mess, then he may get a second set of Malchus. What do I mean? He may get a set of second Malchus. It depends on the following. There's a halacha in Tuma called mechulol v'omed. In other words, he hasn't yet undergone the process of Tara. So in that case, if he's metami himself a second time, then should he be chayav a second set of Malchus if he's still mechulol v'omed? He hasn't added any element of Tuma by being metami a second time. So the Gemara establishes that if he's poresh min hames, he takes his hand away from the mess, and then they give him asra, and he puts his hand back on the mess. Even if it's the same mess, he gets a second set of Malchus. So despite the fact that he's mechulol v'omed, and he's still in a state of tumah, and he has desecrated his kedushas nazirus, and we didn't discuss the concept of kedushas nazirus, nevertheless he gets Malchus for every time that he gets asra. And the purpose of the asra is to separate one action from another, one shtia from the other, one ma'aseh tiglachas from the other, and one tuma from the other.
Are we assuming that the mess was outdoors?
Even if the mess is outdoors, if he has a maga with
I'm saying a heifer. If the mess was indoors, then even if he would touch him a second time, he's still in a constant state of being nitma from the mess because of tumas oil.
Could be. For that, we'd have to learn much more about olos.
Is it the same thing?
Maga stronger. Tumas maga and
right.
Tumas,
That's how he's asking. I don't know. But for that, we'd have to learn Masechet olos.
I think it's the same.
That's what I'm saying. If he's already telling mace and he touches it, doesn't make the issue doesn't seem to be making yourself tame, but to be in contact with too much mace.
Who said that?
no, because if you're
You just said
inside,
that if you
touch
touch the mace,
but if you're indoors,
No, that's about
Then you have
separating
tumas
the
oil.
action.
That's
He was
also an
just
issue.
taking him a mites of Matama. He wasn't also to be
But
nitma to
he
the well.
hasn't toiled, he hasn't become
right? So he's not.
Oh, I
becoming-
see. Daniel is.
He's not becoming more tame the second time he touches it. He's just touching it again.
Daniel's that
I don't know
you?
if he wants to continue with it or not, but I don't. The hashra. Oh,
Anyway, I just wanted to mention
Okay.
there's an amazing chiddush of the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos. The Rambam says that it's possible to get multiple sets of malchus even if the hasra was not separating one shtia from another shtia. For example, says the Rambam, im hisro so mitchila kama pa'omim, if the Edim repeated the hasra over and over again, v'achakach over ala isur kama pa'omim, he gets malchus. And this seems to be against all the Rishonim. The Rishonim say that in order to separate one achila from another achila, one shasiyah from another shasiyah, you need the hasra to wedge as a chatzitza between each action. But the Rambam holds that you can give multiple hasros even before he engaged in the first ma'aseh shtiyah. Now, what's the difference between a regular Nazir, a Nazir Olam, and a Nazir Shimshon? These are the three categories of Nazirus. A Nazir is only for 30 days. And Stam Nazirus, as we said before, the Mishnah Daf Hey, is Shloshim Yom. Then we have another category called a Nazir Olam. And the Gemara says on Daf Dalid that if a person enunciates Hareini Nazir Olam, then he has the same status as Avshalom, the son of David HaMelech, who was a Nazir Olam. Now, what do we get from comparing a Nazir Olam to Avshalom? The Gemara establishes, and this is going to be the daf for this Thursday, Mitzvah Hashem, that we derive from Avshalom the unique kula, the very unique leniency that applies to a Nazir Olam. Because a Nazir Olam obviously will not be able to cut his hair li Olam for the rest of his life. And the kula is that after a certain period of time, we'll see what that period of time is, he's allowed to cut his hair. He's going to have to bring the karbanos of a Nazir, which are 3 karbanos that we mentioned earlier, and afterwards he can cut his hair. Now, at what point can a Nazir Olam cut his hair? The Mishnah speaks about hichbid si'aro. His hair became very heavy. And according to Rebbe, once every 12 months. According to Rabbi Roy, once every 30 days. According to Rabbi Yossi, Erev Shabbos Erev Shabbos. So these are the kulos that apply to a Nazir Olam. Now, how much of his hair is he permitted to cut, this Nazir Olam, either after 12 months, 1 month, or 1 week? According to one shita, he only is allowed to take off from his hair that which will be mekil sa'ara. In other words, his hair is very heavy on his head. He just has to lighten the burden on his head. But Rashi and the Rambam have the opinion that he's melgalech kol sa'aro, kol rosho. He's going to make himself a baldy. What do they call it? Ephes. What were they used to call it? Tiglachas Ephes, or Tisporet Ephes. And not only that, it seems from the Rambam that he's even chayav to do this tiglachas. And basically the lumdus here is that a Nazir Olam, every 12 months, let's say according to Rebbe, will begin a brand new Nazirus. So he has to terminate his original Nazirus, which is a 2-step process. Number 1, he brings his karbanos, and number 2, he does his tiglachas, and he has to completely bald his head. And then he starts a new year of Nazirus. Now we have a third category of a Nazir, and that's called Nazir Shimshon. And on the one hand, the Nazir Shimshon is more chamur than a Nazir Olam, but on the other hand, it's more kal than a Nazir Olam. In what sense is a Nazir Shimshon more kal? He's allowed to be metami l'meisen, and this has to do with Shimshon Agibor. On the other hand, there's a tremendous chumrah that we mentioned earlier. He cannot be shoel on his Nazirus. And there's a whole long discussion here about why he cannot be shoel on Nazirus. But the Mabit from the family of Turani, the Italian scions of those scholars, he has an unbelievable chiddush. And he says that even a Nazir Shimshon, under the following circumstance, can be matir his Nazirus. And that's what's called a Pesach. Because the Mabit understood, and we mentioned this about a month ago or 2 months ago, that Pesach means, had you known X, would you have taken the Nazirus, taken the Neder? And if he says, I never would have taken the Neder, it becomes Nidrei Tos. And if it's Nidrei Tos, then basically you don't even need the Heter, the Chacham. It's almost built in, it's automatic. However, the Chachamim required, for various reasons that he shouldn't be flippant about his Nidarim, they required a Shelas Chacham. So if it's Midin Tos, he would not bring Karbanos because, correct, because the Chacham is Mater Meikaro. Like the Nazir that I met, he had hair down to who knows where. I came in to be Menachem Avil, and he probably never wanted to be matir with a chacham because that would be Oker's Neder Mikaro. So all the years of his Kiyam Nazirus would basically go down the tubes. What else did I want to add? Okay, that's more or less just a little bit of an overview of Masechet Nazir, so to speak. But now we want to get into a real deep issue in Masechet Nazir and in the definition of Nazir. So here, if you happen to have your phone, you could open up your phone to Otzar Yunim, page Aleph.
Otzar what?
Otzar Ha'iyunim, and it's page Aleph.
It's what I sent out yesterday to the group.
You should have it in your phone, hopefully.
In the group thing for,
Okay, then. So here we go. The Gemara at the beginning of Nidarim, so since today we're making a Siyum of Masechet Nidarim, we go back to the first Mishnah Nidarim. That's a minhag in Siyumim that you go back to the first Mishnah to review it. The Mishnah is organized in a certain specific sequence in which Nidarim appear first in the Mishnah and Charamim, because Charamim is also a kind of a neder, and then the Mishnah goes ahead and mentions Shvuah. And the Gemara asks, what's the difference between a neder and a shvuah? And the Gemara establishes that a neder is ka'aser chefza alei, and a shvuah is ka'aser nafshe min hachefza. So that nedarim are iser chefza, whereas shvuah is an iser gavra. And that's the separation, because charamim belongs to nedarim, because cherem is an iser chefza. At the very end of the Mishnah, after shvuos, it says nazirus. So the question is, why was nazirus placed at the very end of the Mishnah? And this touches on the, perhaps, if I want to dramatize the most fundamental issue, and Chakira, and Machlokes Rishonim and Achronim, about the nature of Nazirus, is Nazirus an Iser Chefta, like a Neder, and it means he prohibits the Yayin onto him, or is it an Iser Gavra, in which, because of his state of being a Nazir, as a result, he's enjoined from drinking wine. There's nothing inherently wrong with the wine, so to speak. The wine is not a Hefta D'Isura, but the Gavra will vilify and desecrate his Kedushas Nazirus by drinking the wine. Now, from the fact that the Mishnah puts Nazirus after Shvuos, what does that indicate? What kind of Iser is Nazirus? And nobody's with me? It's an Isa Gavra, excellent. Because had it been an Isa Chefta, it should have been, the sequence of the Mishnah should have been Nidarim, Charamim, Nazirus, and then Shvuos. And this is the diuk of the Rosh. Now, some would say that the difference between an Isa Gavra and an Isa Chefta is purely semantic, but that's not so. There are many, many nafkaminas. We'll mention a few of them that are here summarized on this beautiful, in this beautiful presentation here, between an Isa Gavra and Isa Chefta, with regard to the difference between Nidarim and Shvuos, and the same differences will apply depending upon how you define and classify Nazirus. Number one, the Mishnah says at the end of the first parak in Nidarim that Chomer Nidarmi b'Shvuos. If, let's say, a person takes a shvuah that he won't sit in a sukkah on Sukkos, that shvuah is null and void, because the Torah commanded him, he was mushba miyom Sinai to sit in the sukkah. But if, on the other hand, he creates a neder on the sukkah, and he makes the sukkah into a cheftzah d'isur of a konam, then he's not allowed to sit in that sukkah on Sukkos. Or he says, lulav sheni notel tefillin sheni maniach. So then we have an issue here, which we'll see in a minute, about whether or not Nazirus will be chal on yayin shel kiddush. Because if it's an Isa Gavra, then he's mushba v'yoma to drink that wine, and therefore his Nazirus will not be chal. But if, on the other hand, we define Nazirus as an Isa Chefta, then he has created an Isa in the Chefta of the wine, such that he cannot use it for kiddush. And that's nafkamina number one. The second nafkamina is that a neder is chal on a chefza, and only on a physical davar sheyesh bo mamish, a physical object that's be'en. A shvuah is chal on a davar she'ein bo mamish, which means on an action. And the Rishonim understand
Neder cannot chal on an action.
A neder cannot be chal on an action. Now there's machlokes Rishonim, if he took a neder on an action,
Next neder is going to swim in the sea.
Yeah, well, let's say, for example, a neder is always an iser, except for nidrei hegdish. But in nidrei iser, neder is always iser unless it's what's called nidrei hegdish. That's a neder to bring a carbon. But with the exception of nidrei hegdish, a neder is always to create a cheftzah d'isur. So if he takes a neder that he won't visit his mother-in-law, right? He won't visit his mother-in-law, then that neder is not chal. Because if he says, I won't visit my mother-in-law, that's a shvuah b'loshen neder. Now, there are Rishonim who say that a shvuah b'loshen neder is chal midin yodayim. Because yados nedarim k'nedarim, so he's using an incomplete language. But most Rishonim would say that such a neder is not chal at all. Why? Because he can't create an Iser Gavra in Nidarim. Nidarim has to be an Iser Chefta. A third nafkamina between Nidarim and Shvuos is the question of whether a neder is chal on a shvua. And the answer is that a neder could be chal on a shvua, because a shvua is only an iser gavra, whereas a neder is an iser chefta. A fourth nafkamina between neder and shvua is that a shvua is not chal if he uses a lashon neder. A neder is not chal if he uses a lashon shvua. Number 5, the Marit is machadish achidish here, that if he takes a neder as an iser chefta, then he can aser that chefta on others. Shvua, he can only aser on the gavra himself and not on others. And finally, the Ran has an afkamina in whether or not there's hatfasa. You can't be matfis on a shvua, you can only be matfis on a neder, because hatfasa means from one chefta to the other. And here you'll take a look on page number 2, Beis, in the 3rd paragraph of Omnam, he says, Le'inyan Nazirus, the Gemara, the Shas does not tell us anywhere explicitly whether or not Nazirus is an Isa Gavra like a Shvua or is an Isa Chefta like a Neder. And the Rishonim, the Achronim are all going to express an opinion on this. We'll start with the opinion of the Mari ben Lev, which you'll see on the bottom of the right column on page Beis. And his shita is that Nazirus is an Isa Chefta. And therefore, Nazirus is like a Neder. Now, again, how that kicks into the cases of Tum and Tiglachas, we'll have to see how that works. Maybe in the case of Tiglachas, we can understand that the Chefta of the Sehar is also in the Maisa Giluach, and that makes it into Nisa Chefta. In the case of Tumah, it's really a stretch. But be that as it may, if you can
it's on the goof of the person.
Oh, that we're coming to that as well. But that's not the Mari ibn Leib. The Mari ibn Leib understands that the yayin to a Nazir is mamish a neder. It's an Iser Chefta. Later on, we'll have a different kind of version of the Mari ben Leib.
The Iser is in the yayin.
In the yayin.
Okay.
That's not the Mari Bessin. If you take a look on the left column of page Beis, okay, just to answer your question, Yoni, I was going to make a different point, but once you raise that point, take a look at the Mari Bessin, which is the second major paragraph on the left column of page Beis. He, on the one hand, agrees to the Mari ben Lev, against we'll see the Marid, that Nazirus is an Isa Chefta, but for a different reason. He has a different understanding. It's not that he created a Chefta D'Isur on the Yayin, but rather his body becomes a Chefta D'Isura. And therefore you'll see at the end of that paragraph that Ha'omer, if a person declares Hareini Nazir, it's as if he said, my peh is Asur to Priya Gefen, my seir is also to Tiglachas. Again, he doesn't mention a word about Tumah, but I guess his body is also B'Tumah to have any contact with Tumah. So we have two versions of Iser Chefta in which we classify Nazir as a Neder. One version is that he takes the Chefta of the Yayin and he takes a Neder on the Yayin. The other is that he takes a Neder on his Peh and the Peh becomes Asur B'Shtiyas Yayin. But there's a major objection to this approach of classifying and defining Nazirus as an Iser Chefta. First of all, the Mishnah that we mentioned at the beginning of the Darim, but in another sugya whatsoever. Take a look, if you can, fast forward to page Daled. Now, on page Daled, you'll see Os Gimel on the right side. Do you have that? I'll take a minute to make sure everybody has that. Now, we're going to start with the Marit. And the reason for the Marid, again, I'm sorry that I'm causing you this tirch of going back and forth, but if you take a look on page Beis, the Marid is of the opinion that Nazirus is an Iser Gavra. So again, if we had a whiteboard, we'd write the following. Iser Chefta, Mari ben Lev, and Mari Bessin. Iser Gavra, Marit. Okay, we haven't discussed the Rishonim yet, but we'll see that soon. So the same Marit that we see here on page Beis, who's committed to the position that Nazirus is an Iser Gavra, and he embellishes by saying that basically Nazirus is a Kedusha, It's a sanctity of the person. The famous Ibn Ezra who says Nazir al Rosho has to do with the kedusha of a person, and the discussion of the chinuch. Why does a person? What motivates him to become a Nazir? He wants an extra level of kedusha and precious, and he has a problem with his Yetzer Hara, and he feels that this is the way he'll overcome the Yetzer Hara. But in any event, there's kedushas haguf, and the Marit compares it to Kohen. Just like a Kohen has many, many different Isurim that are all Isurei Gavra because of Kedushas Kahuna, so to a Nazir, insofar as he has sanctified his body with Kedushas Nazirus, Memela, all the Isurim are a reflection of that Kedusha. So that's called an Isur Gavra.
I'm sure I'm jumping the gun, but could you say that according to Mari Besson, the reason he leaves off the Tuma is because as opposed to the Yayin and the Seyar, which he thinks are Isurim, the Tuma stems from the Kedusha.
Correct. Excellent. Excellent. Right. We're going to get back to that very soon. Okay. That maybe we can have a hybrid kind of situation in which there's certainly Isurim in a Nazir that are Isurei Neder and certainly Isurim that are Isurei Gav. How does the Marit prove his point? And this is fascinating. So again, we're on page Dalid, on the right column on the bottom. The Marit says that if you argue that Nazirus is an Isur Chefta, then I don't understand the Gemara in Masechet Nazir on Daf Gimel Amid Beis going on to Daf Dalid Amid Aleph. The Gemara wants to know whether or not a Nazir is enjoined from Kiddush ala Yayin, from Yayin Shel Mitzvah. And the Gemara has the Alfusa. We'll see the Alfusa not today, but Amir Hashem another time. And from this Alfusa, the Gemara proves that the Isur Neder, the Isur Nazirus, is Chal even on what? Even on Yayin Shel Kiddush. Frek the Marit, why do you need a pasuk to establish that there's an Isur of what? Of Shtiyas Yayin Shel Kiddush for a Nazir? That's just an application of the general rule that Nidar Machalim al Dvar Mitzvah. For example, if I take a ned that I won't use this lulav is Asur Alai, or the sukkah is Asur Alai, then I will not sit in that sukkah, I will not take that lulav. Why? Because the mitzvah is a Chovas Gavra, and neder is an Isur Chefta. And a neder is Chal even on a Dvar Mitzvah, as opposed to Shvua, because he's Mushba V'yod Ein Shvuah Shvua. So you can't be Nishba Levatel Sab Mitzvah, but you could take a neder Levatel Sab Mitzvah. If that be the case, then the Nazirus, insofar as it's an Isur that's inherent, according to the Mari Besson, in the Chefta of the Yayin, the Mari Ben Leib, I should say, let's go with that Shita, then for sure he can't drink that wine for Kiddush, because like any neder that's Chal on a Dvar Mitzvah, so too Nazirus as an Isur Chefta is going to be Chal on a Dvar Mitzvah. And the Mishnah says in Nidarim Tezayin, Chomer b'Nidarim v'Shvuos, Kodem Sukkah Alai, Lulav Alai, Tefillin Alai, is b'Nidarim also b'Shvuos Mutter. So why does the Gemara need a Gzeres HaKosav and a Alfusa to establish what is Pashut as an application of the general universal rule that Nidarim Achalim al Dvar Mitzvah? Beautiful, beautiful proof of the Marid. The Marid has another proof, which you'll see on page Hey, in the paragraph that starts Ode. Yeah, and he says the following. If a person says, he declares Hareini Nazir, al menas she'ehei shose yayin. Okay, you know what? This is very complicated. I'm not sure, given the time allotment, that we should get into this. I'll tell you what, Rabbi, I'm just going to say this over, and I'm just going to ask you to hold your questions on this paragraph, because otherwise we won't get to what we have to cover today. Hareini Nazir al menas she'ehei shose yayin. So basically, he's contradicting himself. He is taking a neder of Nazirus, but he's saying that he should be allowed to drink wine. And what happens in such a case? It's like Masnal Mashakosav B'Torah. His Tanai is Batel, and the Nazirus is Chal. And that the Marit establishes based on a Mishnah Daf Yud Aleph. HaOmer, quote, Hareini Nazal Menashe Ehei Shose Yayin, U'metamil Mesim, Harezen Nazir V'Asu V'Kulam. V'im Kasheru Omer Hareni Nazir, it means that there's an Isur Yayin and all the other Isurim, Nazirus, Tiglachas, and Tuma. Madua lo yehe efshal lahachel Nazirus, rak legabi Tuma v'Tiglachas lo legabi Yayin. Why is there a distinction between Yayin on the one hand and Tuma and Tiglachas on the other? Hare lo oser atzmo ela be'elu. He doesn't create an Isur except on those, but he doesn't accept himself an Isur on Yayin. So if the Isur of Yayin for Nazir is an Isur Chefta, why can't he exclude the Isur of Yayin? Elavada, it means that Nazirus is an Isur Gavra. And what's the Isur Gavra? It's an all-inclusive Isur that includes within it Yayin as well. So the Kedushas Nazir is antithetical to Shtiyas Yayin. And therefore we understand the Mishnah that he cannot take this Nazirus and omit out of his Nazirus the Isur of Shtiyas Yain. Again, this requires a lot more study, but that's what we wanted to see. Now, let's take a look at the Tshuvas Aradbaz. The Tshuvas Aradbaz is on the bottom of page Beis. Okay, and then it's the last paragraph on page Beis. If you hold that Nazirus is all Isur Nazirus are Isur Torah, then what happens im Hotzi Nazirus B'Loshen Neder? He says the following. Nazirus has two dimensions to it. With regard to Yayin, and this is what I think, Yoni, you were saying before, Yayin is an Isur Chefta. In that sense, the Radbaz is on the turf of the Mari Ben Le. But as far as Tuma and Tiglachas, that's an Isur Gavra. There's no Isur Chefta here, neither in the Tuma or in the Seyar. And Kevin Shekain, Nazir Shotzia, Bein B'Loshen Shvua, Bein B'Loshen Neder, Chal L'Kuli Alma, a pella of a chidush. We had a discussion about Neder B'Loshen Shvua, Shvua B'Loshen Neder, and we said that according to many Rishonim, the Neder is not Chal B'Loshen Shvua, and vice versa. But he says that in the case of Nazirus, it would always be Chal according to everyone, because Mimonavshach. If he used a Lashon Shvua, then that's an appropriate language with regard to Tum and Tiglachas. If he used a Lashon Neder, that's an appropriate language with regard to the Isur Yayin. And therefore, no matter what dimension you're talking about, his Lashon of Kabbalah's Nazirus, whether it's the Lashon Shvua or the Lashon Neder, is a valid Kabbalah's Lashon. So I bring this to your attention because the Radbaz is defining Nazirus as a hybrid, and it has two dimensions to it. As far as the Rishonim are concerned, because until now we've been dealing with Achronim, the Ritva goes on record as saying that Nazirus is an Isur Chefta. He's Medaik from Rashi, that Rashi holds that Nazirus is an Isur Gavra. But he himself holds that Nazirus is an Isur Chefta. Tosfos, which you'll see on the top of Gimel on the left column, asks, why do we need the Pasuk in Masechet Nazir to prohibit a Nazir from Yain Shel Mitzvah? And Tosfos comes to the conclusion that Nazirus is Eino Oser Sayayin Olav, because again, if he was creating an Isur Chefta in the Yain, I would not need a pasuk to teach me that there's an Isur of Yain Shel Mitzvah. Ella, but rather, what is Nazirus? Oseres Atzmal Yain. So if it's an Isur Gavra, then we understand very well that he cannot be mafkia himself from the Chiyuv Mitzvah. That's why we need Exeris HaKosav, a separate Yalfusa, to prohibit Yain Shel Kiddush for Nazir. By the way, he doesn't mention it here, we'll have it later on, that as far as Yain Shel Kiddush, there's a Rashi here, we're not sure if it's Rashi, it's the Mefaresh, who says that Yain Shel Kiddush is Doraisa. It's against everything that we know about Yain Shel Kiddush. In any event, we have here the Mishnah again, that the Mishnah has Nazirus at the end of the Mishnah at the beginning of Nedarim, which indicates that it's an Isur like Shvua, and that's the Rosh's Diuk, which you'll see in the paragraph V'chein Mevuar B'divrei Harash. And now we fast forward to page Ches. I'm not sure you have page Ches, or you don't have page Ches.
I'll copy it.
Oh, you want to take a picture of it? Do I have to move away or you
No,
can?
it should-
Okay, good.
Let me just, okay, take it,
Oh, okay.
this decision.
So the Mari
Excuse me,
ben
Rosh, I
Lev,
just need 1 second.
yeah, oh, where am I supposed to be?
I think this is good, just a second.
My classic example of like lack of punctuation cause confusion.
I was holding my breath there. Okay. The Mari ben Lev says that a person who accepts upon himself Nazir's B'lashon Shvua ain't ochal, because Mari ben Lev, if you remember, was of the opinion that Naziris is an Isa Chefta. So therefore, if he uses a Lashon Shvua, the Naziris is not chal. The Marit, on the other hand, is of the opinion that if he takes Naziris B'lashon Shvua, it's fine, because Marit understood and defined Naziris as an Isa Gavra. If Naziris is an Isa Gavra, like Shvua, then Naziris B'lashon Shvua is effective. In Shulchan Aruch Yoredeya, Siman Reish Vav, he paskins that Naziris is chal b'lashon shvua. So it means that according to the Beis Yosef, according to the Maran HaMachaber, Naziris is an Iser Gavra, meaning that already early in the Piskei Halacha, we have a commitment to the Shita of the Marit, which is really the Shita of Rashi and the Shita of the Rosh, that Naziris is an Iser Gavra, and therefore Hotzia B'lashon Shvua is a Divrei HaKol Asur. And the Beis Yosef himself says that the source for this psak is the Rosh at the beginning of the Darim, explaining why Naziris is mentioned at the end of the Mishnah. And now we want to learn the Avnei Meluim. Rabbi say, if I can get by with this Avnei Meluim, then I'm going to be very excited. You know that the Avnei Meluim was the same author as the Ketzos HaChosh.
And what else?
I don't remember what else.
Sheshvatzim.
Oh, the Sheshvatzim, of course. Okay. Comes along the Avnei Meluim, after quoting the Marit that Naziris is an Iser Gavra, and basically what is the mechanics of Naziris according to the Marit? He accepts upon himself the status as a Nazir, which is Kedushas Nazir, and all these Surim will develop and emanate from that Iser Gavra, and therefore he's not allowed to this, he's not allowed to that, and he's not allowed to that. Oh. However, do you remember that we discussed earlier that if he drinks wine, he gets 2 sets of malchus, one for violating the Iser of Yayin, and secondly for Bal Yachel bin Nazirus. Okay, this becomes absolutely critical now for the discussion of the Avnei Meluim. When he accepts upon himself Hareini Nazir, the Torah, the status of a Nazir, and therefore as a result he has to observe his Kedushas Nazir by abstaining from X, Y, and Z, then what happens is that all these Isurim basically together form one entity of what we call Bal Yachal Dvaro, means the Torah's Nazir. So when he says already Nazir, and he transforms himself into what we call Torah's Nazir, Kedushas Nazir, then that Kedushas Nazir expresses itself in those 3 Isurim. And therefore, the Avnei Meluim tells us that according to the Marit, if let's say those Lavim would not be Chal, then there's no Iser Bal Yachel as well. Because the Bal Yachel, which means observe the sanctity of Toar Nazirus, expresses itself in those 3 ways. If Lu Yitzur, those 3 Lavim would be removed, then according to the understanding of the Avnei Meluim in the Marit, there would be no Iser Bal Yachel Dvaro. Do you follow? So Bal Yachel Dvaro is a Kedushas Nazir that expresses itself in those 3 Isurim. Let's say we'd remove those lav. Now, how do you remove those lav? It comes along the Avnei Meluim, quoting a Tshuvas Rashba, and he comes up with a Hechatimtza in which there are no 3 lavim for the Nazir, which means that according to his understanding of the Marit, Memela, his whole Kabbalah of Hareini Nazir falls by the wayside. What happens? A person took a Shvuah, Shalo Eshte Yayin, and then he accepted upon himself Nazirus, and then he drank wine. How many Malchus should he get? Does he get Malchus for violating the Shvuah? Absolutely. Unquestionably. Does he get an additional set of malchus for violating his nazirus? Says the Rashba, Ein Iser Chal Iser. And the nazirus is not chal on the shvua. And that's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins in Yoredei Siman Reish.
Nazirus and Iser Kolel?
Oh, Hiksha Avnei Maluim. Hare Nazirus Nesar and Nazirus Nesar b'shlosha mina b'tiglachas b'tum v'yayin im kain hareze Iser Kolel. I keep telling Howie that he should have been one of the Rishonim. So this is the kasha that he asks: How could the Rashba assume that ain't Iser Chalisa when we have an Iser Kolel? Okay, he took a shvur not to drink wine, but now with his Nazirus, his Iser expands to include what? Not only yayin, but also tuma and tiglachas. So therefore, the Avnei Maluim says we have no question about it. We must conclude that Nazirus is not an Iser Kola. Why? Because we break down Nazirus into its individual Isurim. He prohibits yayin, and that's a separate lav for enjoining him from drinking wine, and tiglach semitzora. But the Iser yayin is an Iser bifnei atzmo, and it's identical to the Iser of Shvuah, and therefore the Rashba applies the principle of an Iser Chal Iser. So the Avnei Maluim asks the following question: wait a second, how could you tell me that you break down the Nazirus into 3 different segments, and therefore the Iser of a Nazir and joining him from Yayin is a separate Iser, and it's a Iser Chal Iser because he already took a Shvuah not to drink the wine? What about the lav of Bal Yachal Dvaro? Bal Yachal Dvaro is an Iser lav that's kolel the 3 different lavim. It's one lav that generates 3 different Isurim. And if that be the case, if you have one lav that generates 3 different Isurim, then that lav should be chal on top of his shvuah because it becomes an Iser kolel. And that's what he says on the bottom of the last line of page Ches. Okay, I'm sorry, you don't. Oh, maybe you do have it now?
No, it didn't go through.
Oh, it didn't go through. He says, Avadain kosher. Sheachayev mishum bal yachal de nazirus, right? And he says that that's an Iser kolel that includes within it all 3 Isurim. And Yeshli Yashav al Pishita Samarit. And he says the following: that the Marit's lumdus and the mechanics of the Marit is that the Shem Toar and the Kedushas Nazir as an Iser Gavra expresses itself in 3 different Isurim. If you remove those Isurim, then Memela there's no Bal Yachal Dvara. And that means the following: that since he took an Iser of Shvuah not to drink the wine, and now the wine can't be chal as an Iser Nazir, is Memela once you remove the lav of Shtiyas Yayin, then the Bal Yachal Dvara of Shtiyas Yayin falls off. So there's no Bal Yachal Dvara, on Shtiyas Yayin, and therefore you can't call it an Iser Kolel. Okay, then again, Rabbosai, this required, he has pages and pages on this. Okay, now we fast forward to page Yud. Oh, how are we doing on the clock? I just want to see if I could fit in. You know what? I'm going to skip. I'm going to go Shalom Lefi Seder just to make sure that we get in a very, very important Chakira in terms of Karbanos of a Nazir. And this is on page Yud Aleph. Just make a note of it, and I'll give it to you as homework. Hachronim danu begeder chiyuv nazirus bekarbanos. Anybody want to guess what the Chakir is, Howie? I'm sure you can. Can you give me 2 definitions of karbanos of a Nazir?
Somebody help me.
Come on, Rabbosai. This is a real classic lumbus. No, is the karbanos of a Nazir a separate chiyuv that's chal on the Nazir, or is it part and parcel of his original Kabbalas Nazirus? Tosfos on Daf Yud Aleph says that how does Tanai work in Nazirus? The Gemara all over the show is full of Tanai in Nazirus. He can make a Tanai in Nazirus just like he can make a Tanai in the Dharma Shvuos. So the Tosfos asks the following question. We have a principle that Kol Milsa to lesser b'shlichus, lesser b'Tanai. If you can't set up a shliach, then you can't set up a Tanai. How could Tanai work in Nazirus? No one could be your shliach to be a Nazir. I can't say, well, I'm a Nazir, but you be my shliach to be Mekayim Nazirus. And that's a sugya Masechet Yevamis. The Gemara learns from the parsha of Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain that since Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, with regard to Chalukas Eretz Yisrael, is a case where you could have sent a shliach, and in fact, the entire Parsha Shlichus is based on Chalukas Eretz Yisrael in Masechet Kedushin, is therefore, when does the Tanai work? You can operate with a Tanai only if you could operate with Shlichus. Reb Chaim has a lot of Torah on this. Reb Chaim holds it's all a matter of Bailus and Das. If I have Bailus and Das, then I can set up a Shliach. If I have Bailus and Das, then I can limit my Chalos with a Tanai. Again, that's an hour's discussion. But be that as it may, Tosfos asks an obvious question. You can't send the Shliach for Naziris. How can you make it Tanai? And for Tosfos, one word, Karbanos. Tosfos says, because I can appoint you as my Shliach, I'm a Nazir, I can appoint you as a, I shouldn't say that, right? I can appoint you as my Shliach to bring my Karbanos, and therefore it's considered as a Maisa Sheyachal Liasas Aydei Shliach. So the Chazon Ish asks the following question. Okay, very nice. You can send a shliach to bring your karbanos, but karbanos is not a chelek mi nazirus. It's a separate chovas gavra. Again, he doesn't use that language. But so the answer is apparently that karbanos is bechlal kabbalas nazirus. It's an integral part of his kabbalas nazirus, that he accepts nazirus, which means that the determination of nazirus, he is obligated to tiglachas, to bring his karbanos and then to shave his head. And he quotes here the Marit al-Ghazi on page Yud Beis and the Nitziv Mivalozhin from Hamek Shela, that the Gemara says on Daf Tes that Naziris is like Hegdesh. Why? What's the Tzad HaShava? What's the common denominator between Naziris and Hegdesh? He says, Mishum shekabalaso bikabalaso areyuru bekabel al atzmo karbanos hanaziris. So he's already accepting upon himself a neder of Hegdesh, because included in his kabbalas naziris is a commitment to bring what? To bring his karbanos. And therefore, the Achronim want to say, this is Pnei Yeshua, the Afla, and everybody says it, that Tosfos had a problem. How could Tanai work in Naziris? Because Naziris is less of a shlichus. So the question is, what about Nidarim? There's no such thing as a shliach for Nidarim, and yet a Tanai is operative in Nidarim, left, right, and center. He says because Nidarim is Dibur. Nothing changes as a result of the neder. It's all a matter of Dibur. And with regard to Dibur, we don't have all the limitations that apply to a Tanai. B'nai Gad B'nai Ruvain is not Dibur. That's Chalukas Eretz Yisrael. It's a Chalos Kinyan. Nazirus is also a Chalos because it generates a Chiv Karbanos. And with regard to a Chiv Karbanos, we already have the principle of Mirasal Gvokim Sirasal Hejo, that Kabbalas Chiv Karbanos is considered like a Chalos. It's a Chalos that generates an obligation to bring these Karbanos. It's Nechshav Kemaisa, and therefore we need the Parsha of Tanai, which only applies when there's Shlichus, and the answer is, as Tosfos says, there's Shlichus in Karbanos. The Sifri in Parshas Naso has an unbelievable chiddush. He says, Ki yafli lindar neder, afilu nadar bekarban, yehi nazir, Talmud Lomer Nazir ad sheyidar benidro shel nazirus. What does this mean? This is like Chinese. He says that Yachol, there was a havamina that you can be makabel yourself nazirus. Sheyehei ben nazir al yedei sheyikabel beatzmo karbanos nazir. So imagine a person, instead of saying already nazir, he says already makabel al atzmi lahavi karbanos nazirus. And since that's one of the various aspects in Din of Nazirus, as we said, well, I don't know if we mentioned it or we didn't mention it, but if you makabel on yourself Nazirus b'miktas, then ein Nazirus l'chatzon, the Nazirus is poshet, is chal on the entire package of Nazirus. Here, what dimension of his Nazirus did he makabel? He took upon himself to bring karbanos of Nazir. And the Sifri says that logically, if not for the miyut in the pasuk, we would have said that he's a full-fledged Nazir. And it's as if he took a neder min ayayim, mechartzanim, etc., etc. Why? It must be that the Sifri understood, like we saw in Tosfos, that the karbanos of a Nazir are part and parcel of his kabbalas nazirus. And he says, "B'tama dover shetzarich yalfusa lamed sha'akum eina b'toras nazirus." The Gemara has a special limud that a goy cannot be a Nazir. Ulegoyim nami itzrich miuta, says Tosfos that the reason why I would have a havamina that a guy is included in the parsha of Nidarim is because he's of Nazirus is because he's included in the Pasha of Karbanos. Because a guy could be no dare to bring a carbon, and we accept his carbon. As Havamina, we would have thought that since the essence of Nazirus includes the Chi of Karbanos, that when a guy is Makabal himself Nazirus, therefore, essentially inherent in Nazirus is a Kabbal's Karbanos, and therefore the Havamina was a guy without the Yalfusa, he would be included on the Nazirus. Tosis quotes a Tosefta Nazir that you cannot be mafresh your karbanos until you complete your Nazirus. The hafresh has to be kolzman, as long as the Nazirus is not completely chal, then he doesn't bring his karbanos. It could be because tosus l'shitaso that the karbanos are essentially part of the Kabbalah's Nazirus. And now the question is, do we have we have 3 more minutes to talk about Nazirus Shimshon. So what's the difference between Nazirus Shimshon and Nazir Olam? In both cases, the Nazirus continues throughout his entire life. However, there's a very unique aspect, 2 unique aspects of Nazirus Shimshon. We mentioned it before. Number 1, that a Nazir Shimshon is not prohibited from being Metame Lames. A Nazir Olam is like any Nazir, he's Asur B'Tuma. A Nazir Olam has a kula, as we said before, that he can regenerate or restart up his Nazirus, let's say every 12 months, according to Rebbe, by being Mekil, the COVID of the Seir, and doing a Tiglachas after he brings his Karbanos. With regard to a Nazir Shimshon, he doesn't have that leniency. He has to let his hair grow during the entire course of his life. Furthermore, there's no she'ela on Nazir Shimshon. Rashi explains, Nazir Shimshon lo efshal lishtuli alayhu, he cannot be shoel on his Nazirus, mishum de Shimshon lo havi nodur. Very strange language in Rashi on Daf Yudal. Again, I'm not sure if it's Rashi or not, but let's call it Rashi. So Shimshon lo havi nodur. What does that mean? Now on Masechet Nazir, we have amongst the Bali Atosis the Rivan. And the Rivan says, what does it mean? That Shimshon kibel es naziruso al yidei malach. And davar shutzivui milamala ein bo haTorah. You can't be matir something that was generated by the heavens. And the Ritva also agrees to the Rivan, and many other Rishonim apparently do. The Meiri adds that kol davar shekadosh me'elav. Right, there are 2 types of kedusha. You could be makabel on yourself kedusha, and then this kedusha me'elav, like bechar, for example. V'eino mikoach neder ein lo haTorah. And the Meiri gives the example. Taka, I thought of bechar shekadosh mirechem imo ein lo haTorah v'chein shimshon lo hay lo haTorah lefisha haysa kedushasa me'elav al yidei amalach. And therefore, when I become a Nazir Shimshon, then I have the same dinim of Shimshon, and there's no she'ela on Nazirus of Shimshon.
But you can never be mamash Nazir Shimshon.
What do you mean? You mean Bisman Hazeh because there are no karbanos?
No,
what do you say?
Never, because you have to have a Nazirus that
So if a malach comes to you and makes you
he's being makabel on himself the Nazirus of Shimshon, meaning the Nazirus of Shimshon today or throughout history was a Kabbal's Nazirus, but that Kabbal's Nazirus has the same dinim and it's patterned identically after what? What's the prototype? Shimshon HaGibor. And just like Shimshon HaGibor had a Nazirus min HaShamayim, and therefore it doesn't lend itself to Torah, so to anyone who has the status of Nazir Shimshon cannot be matir his
except I think there should be 2 aspects to it. Yeah. It's like Nazirus Shimshon, that Nazirus Shimshon has no Torah,
right?
But it did not come from a malach.
Correct. He's accepting upon himself, which he can do, Nazirus Shimshon.
But if he accepted it upon himself, why isn't there Torah on it?
No, again, he's taking upon himself Nazirus Shimshon. And whatever dinim
But he
applied to
could-
Nazir Shimshon, he accepted
But
upon
him-
himself.
But on the other
Not-
hand,
again, not for the reason.
if he's doing it himself, why
I
isn't there a
understand.
Hatara?
Right, again.
It's not, because it wasn't really a malach that came down. He's saying that I want
Correct,
what should be.
correct, absolutely. But he wants to accept upon himself the identical Nazirs as Shimshon.
It's like a
Why was Shimshon
Understood, but it's he who wanted to do it. So why isn't there a Hatara then?
Because
again?
because there is Hatara.
We're only we're only giving an explanation as to perhaps why the Torah says that Shimshon himself could not be mati, but that doesn't matter. That's only like together like Tamei mitzvahs, but there is an entity
I hear.
called Nazir
Okay.
Shimshon, and he accepted upon himself Nazir Shimshon. Okay, Rabbosai. So that I think is a pretty fair introduction to Masechet Nazir, and Yiratzon that we should be matzliach in learning that Masechet. Okay, then everyone should have a great day.
This is quite a sheer. This is quite a.
Yeah, I tried to pack it in.